Chapter 15. It means the death of our free commonwealth. 'Twill be the end of all we've worked for. The angry voices came clearly through the closed door of the company room. It was impossible not to overhear. Mercy's spinning wheel faltered, and Rachel's hand, lighting a pine knot, trembled so that a spark fell on the table unheeded and left a small black scar. Frequently in the past month, the same grim-faced men had called upon Matthew Wood, but tonight the voices had a frightening quality. They must think it a desperate matter to meet like this on the eve of the Sabbath, said Mercy. Your father never touched his supper, fretted Rachel. Do you suppose it would do to offer them all a bite when they come out? Kit dropped a stitch for the third time. She had little concern for the colony of Connecticut, but she was seething with curiosity over one aspect of tonight's business. Some time ago, William had arrived, offered his usual courteous greetings to the women, and then, instead of taking his place by the fireside, had astounded her by knocking boldly on the company room door. More surprising still, he had been admitted, and there he had stayed, behind that closed door, for the past half hour. Pride could not restrain her tongue another moment. What in the world is William doing in there? She burst out. Why would Uncle Matthew let him in? Didn't you know? Judith threw her a condescending glance. Know what? William came over to Father's way of thinking 2 months ago, even before his house was raised, when he had to pay such high taxes on his land. Now how did Judith know that? Kit stared at her. I never heard him say a word about it. Maybe you just weren't listening. Judith's tone had more than a touch of smugness. Chagrined, Kit jerked at another drop stitch. It was true. Sometimes when William and Judith were talking about the house, it was all she could do to keep her mind from wandering. But she knew she should have remembered anything as important as this. Was William ashamed to admit to her that he had turned against the king? Or did he think she was too stupid to understand? The voices broke out again. This Governor Andros says right out that deeds signed by the Indians are no better than scratches of a bear's paw. We are all to beg new grants for land we've bought and paid for, while the fees alone will leave us paupers. They can come into our meeting house and order us to kneel and whine tunes like the Church of England. My cousin in Boston actually had to put his hand on the holy book to swear in court. I'll shoot any man tries to make me do that. They could hear Matthew's voice, cold and steady, never raised or out of control. Whatever happens, he was saying, we do not want any shooting here in Connecticut. Why not? Broke in another voice. Should we hand over our freedom without a murmur like Rhode Island? I say defy him, came a hoarse shout. 9 trained bands we have ready in Hartford County, nigh unto 1,000 men. Let him look into a row of muskets and he'll change his tune. It would mean senseless bloodshed, Matthew said clearly. For nearly an hour the voices went on, the angry shouting gradually giving way to low, tense words that could not be distinguished. Finally, a silent, tight-mouthed group of men emerged with no interest in the refreshment that Rachel timidly offered. When they had gone, Matthew lowered himself heavily into a chair. It's no use, he said. We must spend the Sabbath in prayer that God will grant us patience. Rachel searched for some words of comfort. I know it is a disappointment, she attempted, but will it truly change our lives so very much? Here in Wethersfield, I mean. We will still all be together in this house, and surely we will not lose our rights as citizens of England. Her husband brusquely waved away her comfort. That is all a woman thinks about, he scoffed. Her own house. What use are your so-called rights of England? Nothing but a mockery. Everything we have built here in Connecticut will be wiped out. Our council, our courts will be mere shadows with no real power in them. Oh, we will endure it, of course. What else can we do? If only we could somehow hold back the charter itself. This man has no right to take it from us. Not till later, when she and Judith undressed, shivering in the chilly upstairs chamber, did Kit dare to venture a comment. They don't seem to realize, she whispered, how powerful the royal fleet is. Once, when the royalists were trying to hold Bridgetown, Barbados, Parliament sent a troop ship and subdued them in no time. Oh, I don't think there'll be any fighting, said Judith confidently. It's just that men like Father don't like to be dictated to. But Dr. Bulkley says the charter was never intended to be as free as they have made it. He thinks the men of Connecticut have taken advantage of the king's generosity. So I suppose John thinks so too, Kit couldn't resist adding. Once Judith would have flared, but her new happiness was hard to shake. Poor John, she laughed now. He's so mixed up between Dr. Bulkley and Father. Honestly, Kit, I agree with Mother. I don't believe it would change our lives much. Men make an awful fuss about such things. I just wish it hadn't happened 4 days before Thanksgiving. It's going to spoil the holiday to have everyone so gloomy. I'd be curious to see this, Governor Andros, said Kit. You remember Dr. Bulkley told us he used to be a captain of the dragoons in Barbados. Maybe we can see him, said Judith, blowing out the candle and hopping into bed. If he comes up from New London, he'll have to cross the river at Smith's Ferry. I'm going to get a peek at him no matter what Father says. You don't often get a chance to see all those soldiers in uniform. For a good many Wethersfield citizens, curiosity got the better of loyalty on the next afternoon. Kit and Judith met a fair number of farmers and their wives traveling along South Road and ranging along the bank of the river. They had a good hour's wait ahead of them, lightened by the arrival of an escort from Hartford led by Captain Samuel Talcott, one of the Wethersfield men, Kit noted with surprise, who had occasionally joined the meetings in her uncle's company room. I'd have no part in greeting that Andros, commented one farmer. The crowds would pick my bones before I'd do it. Look at that fine horse all ready for his highness. They should have asked me. I'd have found the horse for him all right. Captain Talcott sensed the growing anger in the waiting crowd and raised his voice. There is to be no demonstration, he reminded them. The governor comes here under orders from His Majesty. He will be received with all due courtesy. Presently, a murmur arose as the first red-coated horseman appeared on the opposite shore. There he is, excited voices cried. The tall one just getting off his horse. He's getting into the first boat there. The ferry boats crossed the wide river without mishap, and the party from Boston stepped out onto the shore at Wethersfield. More than 70 men there were, with 2 trumpeters and a band of grenadiers. Kit thrilled at the sight of the familiar redcoats. How tall and handsome and trim they looked, beside the homespun blue-coated soldiers. And Andros, he was a true cavalier, with his fine embroidered coat, his commanding air, and the wealth of dark curls that flowed over his velvet collar. How elegantly he set the saddle of his borrowed horse. Why, he was a gentleman, an officer of the King's Dragoons, a knight. Who were these common resentful farmers to dispute his royal rights? He made their defiance seem childish. Governor Andros had no cause to complain of his reception at Wethersfield. The people kept a respectful silence. The Hartford escort saluted and showed a praiseworthy discipline. As the band rode out of sight along the road, a few fists were shaken, and some small boys hurled clumps of mud after the last horse's hoofs. For the most part, it was a somber group that straggled back to their neglected chores. The magnificence of Andros and his procession had shaken their confidence. They all knew that this haughty man was on his way to meet with their council, and that before night fell, he would hold their very lives in his hand. Resignation and despair settled over the household that evening, as though Kit thought it were the eve of that doomsday that the minister warned of in Sabbath meeting. There was no company to look forward to. William was a member of the militia in Hartford, and John had sent word that he must care for 2 of Dr. Bulkley's patients while the doctor attended the session. In Matthew's scowling presence, the others scarcely dared whisper. Kit was thankful when she and Judith could escape to the cold sanctuary of the upstairs chamber. They had been fast asleep for some time when they were startled awake by the thudding of hoofs in the road below and the whinny of a horse suddenly reined in. There was an echoing rap of a musket against the door. Matthew must have been awake and waiting, for before the rapping ceased, they heard the bolts slide back. Instantly, Judith was out of bed, with Kit scrambling after her. Snatching heavy cloaks to pull over their nightclothes, the girls flung open the chamber door. From the opposite room came Rachel, still fully dressed. The 3 women crowded together on the narrow steps. To Kit's astonishment, the man who stepped through the door into the light of Matthew's candle was William. It's safe, sir, he burst out before the door was shut. The charter safe, where he can never lay a hand on it. Thank God, exclaimed Matthew reverently. You were at the meeting, William? Yes, sir, since 4 o'clock. Sir Edmund got a stomach full of talking this day. The speeches of welcome lasted near to 3 hours before he could get in a word of business. And the charter? It was there, all the time, in the middle of the table in plain sight. Sir Edmund made a long speech about how much better off we were all going to be. It got dark, and finally he asked for lights. Before long, the room got hot and full of smoke, and when someone opened a window, the draft blew out the candles. It took quite a few minutes to get them lighted. Nobody moved. Far as I could see, everybody stayed right in their places. But when the candles were lit, the charter had disappeared. They looked high and low for it all over the room and never found a trace. Was the governor angered? You'd have admired him, sir. You couldn't help it. He sat there, cool as an icicle. He knew the paper wasn't going to be found, and he wouldn't stoop to ask a question about it. As it was, he could afford to ignore it. Aye, said Matthew grimly. He had the power in his hands without it. Yes. Governor Treat read a statement, and they all signed it. The colony of Connecticut is annexed to Massachusetts. Governor Treat will be appointed colonel of militia. And Gershom Bulkley? They say he will be appointed a justice of the peace for his loyalty. Snorted Matthew. He thought the news over for a moment. The charter, he insisted. Do you know what happened to it? William hesitated. For the first time, he acknowledged the presence of the three women by one brief embarrassed glance up the stairs. No, sir, he answered. The room was dark. Then how do you know it is safe? It is safe, sir, said William positively. Then we can hold up our heads, said Matthew, taking a long breath. Thank you for coming, my boy. When the door was shut behind William, Matthew turned to the women on the stairs. We can praise God for this night, he said. Now, get to bed, all of you. And remember, if there is any talk about this, you have heard nothing. Nothing at all. Do you understand? Can you sleep now, Matthew? Asked his wife anxiously. Aye, agreed Matthew. I can sleep now. There are hard times ahead for Connecticut, but someday, when the hard times have passed, as they must pass, we will bring our charter out of hiding and begin again, and we will show the world what it means to be free men. The two girls crept back into the cold chamber and climbed shivering into bed. As Kit lay wide awake in the blackness, some distant shouts, a snatch of ruckus, unrestrained singing such as she had never heard before in Wethersfield, sent her mind back to the days of her childhood. She surprised Judith by a sudden giggle. I know where the charter went, she whispered. The spirits took it. What are you talking about? Judith was almost asleep. I just remembered. It's All Hallows Eve. This is the night the witches are supposed to ride abroad on broomsticks, and the spirits do all sorts of queer things. Nonsense, said Judith. We don't hold with saints' days here in New England. Besides, William knows perfectly well where that charter is. I could tell he does. Snubbed again, Kit fell silent and listened to that unaccustomed shouting in the distance. She felt curiously elated. She knew she had overheard an account of serious insubordination to the king, yet in her heart she was glad that her uncle had known this small victory. Now, perhaps they would have some peace in the house. No, it was more than that. Tonight, she had understood for the first time what her aunt had seen in that fierce man to make her cross an ocean at his side. There was a sort of magnificence about him, even without the fine uniform that made Governor Andros so splendid. Lying there in the dark, Kit had to admit it. She was proud of him.